I had my rival, Angus, exactly where I wanted him. I made him swallow 3 whole pills. With red-rimmed eyes, he cursed me, yet his body melted against mine, refusing to let go, and we stayed like that all night. Just as he relentlessly demanded another round, I reached my limit, pulled him down, and whispered in his ear. What I gave you were just vitamins. You absolute freak. The story, the word sold, glared from the auction house's massive screen, reflecting the irritation in Carlos' fingertips as they tapped against the armrest. Since childhood, Angus had been an inescapable shadow in Carlos' life. Anything Carlos wanted, this man would snatch away midway, always wearing that flawless, gentle smile. When the top-tier emerald meant for his grandmother fell into Angus' hands yet again, Carlos lost his patience completely, accepting a proposal from Angus' shady friend, Billy, and buying into this expensive master plan of revenge. Nighttime, in the basement, the pale, blinding light from the incandescent bulbs sliced through the frigid space like a blade. Tall and broad-shouldered, Angus was secured to the load-bearing pillar by cold metal cuffs, his head hanging low and his shirt collar slightly open, resembling a large, unguarded hound caught in a snare. Carlos descended the stairs in his leather boots, toying with a white pill bottle between his fingers. Disliking Billy's suggestion of a potent drug that could easily spiral out of control and implicate him, he simply popped out 3 ordinary vitamin tablets from his daily stash. Just as he turned the corner of the stairs, a low, suppressed chuckle echoed through the empty basement. I've finally waited for this day. Carlos frowned, striding over to the man and deliberately lowering his voice into a wicked sneer. Angus, you are at my mercy now. Swallow this heavy dose. I'm going to make you wish you were dreaming. He roughly squeezed the man's jaw open and slipped the 3 vitamins inside. Angus Adams apple-bobbed almost imperceptibly, and without a single trace of real resistance, he obediently swallowed the pills down. Not even 2 minutes later, Carlos. The man's towering frame leaned toward him with unbearable heat, fine beads of sweat breaking out on his temples and slowly trailing down his taut jawline. What exactly did you give me? It burns. Carlos froze, frantically turning around and staring at the bottle in his hand. The label clearly read vitamins. Click. A sharp metallic snap suddenly echoed behind him. Carlos' pupils shrank as he realized he had forgotten this bastard was a master at picking locks. Before he could step back, a pair of sinewy arms wrapped around his waist from behind with irresistible magnetism. The room spun as Carlos was yanked backward, his back colliding heavily against a solid, scorching chest. Why run? Angus' slightly husky voice brushed against the shell of Carlos' ear, his searing breath instantly bringing an unnatural flush to his earlobe. You gave me the dose. Aren't you going to stick around to see the effects? Let go. Carlos struggled fiercely, his fingers prying at the arm around his waist, but it didn't budge an inch. How do you have so much strength? How could a cheap trick from Billy ever take me down? Angus buried his face deep into the crook of Carlos' neck, his straight nose affectionately and gently nuzzling that small patch of delicate skin, a deep and joyful vibration rumbling in his chest. Carlos' spine instantly stiffened. You did this on purpose. You deliberately let him bring you here? Mm-hmm. Angus' breath fanned across his carotid artery, his voice laced with the lingering sweetness of having gotten his way. After all these years, this is the first time you've actively sought me out. How could I bear to miss it? That was an abduction. I didn't seek you out. To me, it's all the same. Through the thin fabric, Carlos could clearly feel the rapid, powerful beating of the heart behind him, thump after thump, deafening in its intensity. Stop pretending. Let go. Before Carlos could finish, his entire body was spun around by a wave of undeniable domination. Angus braced both hands on the wall beside his ears, trapping him completely in an inescapable space. The warm light hit Angus' face, casting a crimson tint on the corners of his deep eyes. A dark fire, suppressed for years, danced in his pupils, yet it strangely radiated an ultimate cherishing tenderness. What exactly did you give me? Ordinary vitam. A shadow descended, and the rest of his words were completely sealed off. It was a deeply contradictory kiss. It carried a breathtaking intensity, yet revealed a cautious, probing, and soothing comfort as their lips met. The rich golden light around them flickered wildly, like a grand, warm meteor shower, sweeping away every last ounce of the basement's lingering chill. Carlos' mind went blank, and on instinct he opened his mouth and bit down hard. A faint trace of crimson slipped down the corner of his lips. Angus pulled back half an inch with a wince, the pad of his thumb gently wiping away the mark. He stared at Carlos, chuckling between slight pants, his eyes brimming with the obsession of finally holding his most precious treasure. "Are you insane? You crazy hound?" Carlos' chest heaved violently, a layer of mist gathering in the corners of his eyes from the lack of oxygen. "You dosed me first." Angus' voice was as raspy as sandpaper, yet laced with a lethal allure. "You lit the fire yourself. You have to take responsibility." Not giving Carlos a chance to argue, those scorching lips pressed down once more. This time, a broad palm steadily cradled the back of Carlos' head, while the other hand gently held his jaw, the movements demanding yet instinctively avoiding any angle that might cause him discomfort. In the split second before he completely lost his ability to think, Carlos heard a sigh-like murmur deeply branded into his eardrums. "Carlos, I really, really like you." The night lost all restraint, and Carlos' vision swayed wildly. He couldn't even remember how he was half carried, half led from the basement all the way up into the soft sheets of the second-floor bed. All he knew was that whenever he gritted his teeth and tried to yell out that they were vitamins, those words on the tip of his tongue were entirely swallowed by the most unreasonable methods. "Angus, wait a. A scalding fingertip pressed heavily against the resistance at the corner of his lips as the man's sharp features closed in through the dim light, dark golden ripples surging in the depths of his eyes. "Your voice sounds beautiful right now." Angus' tone was husky enough to scrape against the eardrums, carrying an unquestionable authority. "Don't let it go to waste." Outside the window, the moon slowly shifted its angle. Just as the last shred of reason was about to melt away in this drowning warmth, Carlos took a sharp, deep breath. He gripped the wrist bracing beside him tightly, veins popping on the back of his hand, and used every last ounce of strength to pull the man closer. His lips pressed against that reddened ear, squeezing the words out through his teeth. "Angus, what I fed you was vitamins. You absolute freak." All movement ceased abruptly. Moonlight filtered through the crack in the curtains, casting a deep shadow along the side of Angus' straight nose. He lowered his gaze, staring at Carlos' sweat-dampened temples without saying a word. "Did you hear me?" Carlos panted heavily, the corners of his eyes flushed with a forced crimson hue. "I heard you." Angus let out a low chuckle, the vibration of his chest transferring clearly through their pressed skin. Then, that massive shadow descended once again, without a moment's hesitation. "If you heard me, then why are you still? I heard you, but what does that have to do with right now?" Angus turned his head, his searing breath landing on Carlos' shoulder and neck, sending a shiver through him. "I really thought the dose was kicking in earlier, but now I know it's not. Which means there's even less reason to stop." "Angus." The rest of his curses were completely swallowed up in a deep, smiling kiss. The faint light of dawn tore through the veil of night, and the floating dust motes in the air gradually chased away the madness of the evening. Carlos lay sunken into the messy covers, like a rag doll that had been entirely disassembled and put back together. His throat was too hoarse to make a sound, and the energy to lift even a single finger had been drained from him. Meanwhile, the instigator beside him was wide awake and energized. Angus propped himself up on one arm, the golden morning light cascading over his bare back. He languidly toyed with Carlos' hair, his fingertips occasionally brushing against that bright red earlobe. "Haven't you had enough?" Carlos couldn't even be bothered to open his eyes. Not nearly enough. "Get lost. I'm done for." Then, well, stop here. Angus naturally pulled the comforter up, wrapping Carlos entirely in that reassuring, warm orange halo. "Go to sleep." "You're not leaving?" "My legs are jelly. I can't walk." The man let out a shamelessly justified yawn. The dosage wore off. Carlos' eyes snapped open, glaring at him with a deadpan stare. They were vitamins. "What dosage?" "Shh." Angus breezily rested a large hand on his waist, massaging gently. "The sun's already up. Aren't you tired?" Tired. Dead tired. But Carlos didn't even have the energy to throw a punch anymore. An unknown amount of time passed before a frantic buzzing violently dragged Carlos out of his light slumber. Buzz, buzz, buzz. He squinted his dry eyes and fumbled for his phone on the nightstand. The blinding white light of the screen flared to life, 17 missed calls, all from Billy. Billy, Carlos, why aren't you replying? Don't tell me you messed it up. Billy, nothing bad happened after you dosed Angus, right? You two aren't both toast, are you? A slender hand appeared out of nowhere and snatched the phone away. Angus lay on his side against the pillow, eyes half closed as he swiped across the screen. That infuriatingly warm halo rippled lazily through the room with his breathing. Billy, he sure cares a lot about you. You transferred him $1 million? That was a tip. Carlos grumpily reached over to grab the phone back. Angus stayed silent for 2 seconds, then casually picked up his own phone. His fingertips tapped away. Transferred $1 million to Billy as well. A few seconds later, Carlos watched helplessly as Billy's message popped up on the screen. Billy, bro. My absolute favorite bro. I knew you understood me best. Next time there's a sweet deal like this, 50% off. Half off just for you. Below it trailed a row of comical emojis furiously bowing down. The cold light of the screen reflected off Carlos' stunned face as the air around them instantly fell dead silent. Whose side is he actually on? Carlos asked, grinding his molars. Whoever pays him the most. Angus tossed the phone carelessly onto the rug, producing a muffled thud. Like a well-fed large feline, he leaned in once more, resting his chin comfortably on Carlos' shoulder. If I didn't let him set me up, how else would you have come looking for me on your own? He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his face plastered with sheer triumph. The morning light finally breached the windowsill completely, illuminating Angus' profile. Carlos turned his head, his gaze practically tangible as it rested on the man's skin next to him. In that drowningly warm interplay of light and shadow, the crimson tinge at the corners of Angus' eyes hadn't completely faded, and right across his sculpted collarbone, several glaring scratch marks were boldly displayed. Trailing his gaze upward to the carotid artery on his neck, a deep circle of teeth marks, belonging to Carlos, sat proudly, announcing the absolute madness of the previous night. Flashbacks of last night surged into his mind, and a deep flush rapidly climbed up Carlos' profile. Angus, is there something wrong with you? Yeah, love sickness. Carlos decided to close his eyes and play dead, rolling over and tugging the covers tight. But the massive heat source behind him had no intention of letting him go. A sturdy arm wrapped commandingly around his waist, and Angus pressed up from behind like a giant hound, his straight nose affectionately rubbing back and forth against his nape through the thin fabric. What are you doing? Carlos tightened his jawline. Just checking something. Are you a freak? Only for you. Carlos took a deep breath, forcefully pushing down the strange feeling in his chest. But that long finger by his waist began drawing restless circles. 1 circle, 2 circles. Angus. Remove your hand. Oh. A lazy hum sounded from behind. Immediately after, that hand unapologetically crossed his waistline and clamped directly onto a higher spot. All right then. That is not what I meant. Unable to bear it any longer, Carlos sat up, wrapping himself tightly in the blankets. He glared at Angus' face, painted with utter innocence. This man was shrewd to the bone, and from childhood until now, every time he claimed something, he always wore this hypocritical masked facade. Carlos took a deep breath, locking his gaze onto the man's profound eyes, enunciating every word carefully. Angus, what happened last night, let's just pretend none of it ever happened. The moment those words dropped, the surging warm orange hues in the room seemed to freeze over instantly. What did you just say? The man's voice plummeted in temperature. Carlos had never heard Angus use that tone before. Even when snatching away Carlos' prized possessions in the past, the man always wore that infuriatingly effortless smile. But right now, that mask of hypocrisy shattered. Just pretend it never happened. Carlos averted his gaze, biting the bullet as he stared at the wrinkles in the sheets. We never got along anyway. This kind of thing, never got along? Angus shot up abruptly, his dominating silhouette entirely blocking the morning light from the window. The lighting in the room immediately dimmed, as if drained of all warmth, leaving only a cold, rigid grayish white. Carlos, you think I took your things because we never got along? Angus locked eyes with him, a vein pulsing faintly at his temple. You think all these years? The man's voice choked to a halt. His Adam's apple bobbed with immense difficulty, as if desperately holding back some trapped beast threatening to tear his chest apart. When he spoke again, his voice carried a terrifying, teeth-gritting tremor. "Carlos, are you blind? If I didn't like you, why the hell would I pay triple the price to win that stupid piece of emerald? That was meant for my grandmother. You took it, and I bought it because I wanted to give it to you. Wasn't that a provocation?" Provocation. That lingering crimson in the corners of Angus' eyes flared up once more. "What kind of provocation involves me smiling and eagerly offering things up to you on a silver platter? If I didn't step in and take them, would you have ever initiated a single conversation with me in your entire life?" The room fell dead silent. Carlos sat there with his mouth slightly ajar, his pupils trembling. His mind went completely blank. Angus stared at him intently, the dark flame burning in his eyes slowly dying out. He let out a brief, self-deprecating laugh. "Forget it. Pretend it never happened. Fine, whatever you say." He tossed aside the blankets, his bare feet hitting the rug, and turned his back to the bed as he bent down to retrieve his scattered shirt. The morning light hit his broad back, illuminating the crisscrossing red marks, scratches, and various depths of bite marks, a stark, shocking contrast against his cool, pale skin. "Wait a minute." The words slipped out of Carlos' mouth. Angus didn't pause. He swiftly buttoned his shirt, grabbed his jacket, and took long strides toward the door. "Angus," I said, "wait." Seeing the man about to grab the doorknob, Carlos panicked. He flung the covers aside and rushed recklessly out of bed. But the moment his feet touched the floor, his knees gave way uncontrollably. With a dull thud, Carlos stumbled, falling to his knees on the freezing floor in a pitiful heap. The footsteps by the door halted abruptly. Angus turned around, looking at Carlos, collapsed on the floor. His rigid posture froze for half a second before he helplessly slumped his shoulders, let out a heavy sigh, and strode back to the bed, crouching down beside him. "What do you want?" His tone was still clipped. "Help me up." "Can't you get up yourself?" "No, my legs gave out." Carlos looked up, his eyes glassy with a thin layer of redness from the pain and grievance. The tight muscles in Angus' face twitched slightly, and the morning light perfectly caught a rapidly spreading, nearly transparent blush on the tips of his ears. "Serves you right," he muttered under his breath, yet he still offered his broad palm with unwavering steadiness. Carlos grabbed that hand tightly. The moment he used it to pull himself up, another wave of weakness washed over his legs. He completely lost his balance and pitched forward headfirst into the man's broad, solid chest. Angus' body instantly went rigid as an iron board, his hands hovering midair, but he didn't push him away. "Angus!" Carlos buried his burning face deeply into the crook of the man's neck, his muffled voice trembling. "Do you like me?" Through the sheer shirt, Carlos could distinctly feel the heart inside that body, hammering at an almost insane rhythm, vibrating so intensely it made his own chest feel numb. "I just spelled it out clear as day, and you're still asking? Answer me." "Yes." Angus dipped his head slightly, resting his jaw softly against Carlos' hair, his voice raspy and humbled down to the dust. "I like you. I've liked you for a very long time. Are you happy now? Then why did you keep taking my things?" Carlos' fingertips gripped the fabric of Angus' shirt tightly. "Like I said, if I didn't take your things, you wouldn't even spare me a single glance. You could have just talked to me like a normal person. Did you ever give me a chance?" Angus finally closed his arms, holding the person in his embrace tightly. He looked down, his deep eyes reflecting Carlos' bewildered expression. "Every time you saw me, you'd roll your eyes. I'd speak 3 sentences, and you wouldn't reply to even one. If I just tried talking to you normally, would you have ever paid attention?" Carlos was left utterly speechless. "I know it's stupid." Angus' warm fingertips gently brushed against the side of Carlos' face, his thumb caressing the reddened corners of his eyes. In those eyes, which were always filled with calculation and disguise, only a raw, defenseless vulnerability and helplessness remained. But Carlos, I had no other choice. Carlos stared intently at those eyes swirling with a mix of crimson and grievance. "Last night's scorching, I really like you, along with the countless times over the years when the man had handed things over with that never-finished sentence. I saw you really liked this, so I... All of it overlapped in Carlos' mind. So I wanted to give it to you. So I bought it specifically for you. So, could you please look at me? Carlos suddenly realized he truly was blind. But how could anyone blame him? That whole routine of swooping in with a fake smile to steal his thunder, anyone would take that as a taunt. Angus, Carlos spoke softly. Yeah, the man's voice still carried a cautious tension. Give me back the emerald. Didn't you say you didn't want it? I want it now. Carlos stared right into his eyes. And everything else you took from me before, give it all back. Angus froze for a second, the corners of his mouth curving upward uncontrollably. It was a smile completely stripped of all defense and calculation, radiating genuine, goofy happiness. Okay. I'll get them for you when we go back. No more taking things from me from now on. Okay. And one more thing. What? Without any warning, Carlos stood on his tiptoes. His warm lips brushed perfectly against the corner of the man's mouth like a weightless feather. This is me giving something back to you. The air around them completely stalled for a second. Angus stiffened into a statue. Slowly, he raised his hand, his calloused fingertips ghosting over the corner of his mouth in disbelief. A deep flush burned from the tips of his ears all the way down to his neck, and even his towering frame trembled faintly. Carlos? His voice shook terribly. Kiss me again. Nope, my lips are tired. Then I'll kiss you. The shadow swept down eagerly. When their lips met, Carlos clearly felt how those lips, which usually spouted the most self-righteous words, were quivering intensely right now. This guy, so arrogant and overbearing when stealing things, pathetically cowardly when confessing, and now trembling like a smitten teenager having his first kiss. Carlos closed his eyes. It seems, it's really not that bad after all. Only later did Carlos realize that once a man like Angus breached a single line of defense, he would seep in everywhere like an unstoppable tide. On day one, amid the sharp clinking of metal, a new set of keys to the basement was forcefully shoved into Carlos' hands. On day two, the heavy rumble of suitcase wheels rolling across the entryway floor announced that Angus was officially moving himself in. By the morning of day three, a faint scent of burnt food wafted from the kitchen, and Angus, wearing an ill-fitting apron, brought out toast with charred edges and haphazardly chopped lettuce, sitting across the dining table with puppy-dog eyes. It's raining outside. My car is in the shop. My house is under renovation for a year. I'm allergic to five-star hotels that don't have you in them. Armed with these deadpan, bordering on shameless excuses, Angus persistently yet softly infiltrated every single corner of the house. Those visible specks of light seemed to quietly take root between the sofa cushions, on the kitchen counters, and anywhere Carlos cast his gaze. Right up until the end, accompanied by the crisp swish of sliding hangers, Angus' final haute couture shirt was boldly hung up in Carlos' walk-in closet. Angus. Carlos leaned against the closet doorframe, watching the man organize his clothes. Do you honestly think moving in means you've got it all figured out? The rustling of hangers stopped instantly. What I mean is, just because you like me doesn't guarantee I like you back. Angus turned his head, his Adam's apple bobbing. You kissed me that day. That was a momentary impulse. Carlos looked at him, his tone as calm as a placid lake. I said you should return the emerald, but I never said I agreed to be with you. The morning sun sliced through the blinds, painting an interplay of light and shadow across Angus' face. Carlos quietly watched those profound eyes, transitioning from initial confusion to visible hurt, and finally, that crimson hue resurfacing at the edges, morphing into a stubborn, do-or-die determination. Fine. Then I'll pursue you. Angus turned back and securely hung his final shirt on the rail. As the hanger clicked sharply into place, he walked step by step toward Carlos. On that face, which used to wear a mask of effortless cool, nothing was left but unadulterated sincerity, stripped of all pretense. Even though his ears were still flush red, the aura around him was astonishingly bright. It's fine if you don't like me. I'll make you like me. He locked eyes with Carlos, every word carrying weight. Starting tomorrow. No, starting right now. Angus kept his word. For the next entire week, Carlos deeply experienced the sheer force of this man's unfiltered assault, an almost blunt, leave no room for retreat sort of dominant invasion. At 7 a.m. sharp, the warm orange lights in the kitchen would switch on like clockwork. What started as an utter culinary disaster, from bitter, blackened fried eggs on day 1 to charcoal like bread on day 3, eventually transformed. By the 7th day, when Carlos suspiciously eyed a perfectly cooked plate of bacon toast, the morning light highlighted the faint, dark circles under the man's eyes. To produce a breakfast that was neither too salty nor burnt, this impeccably suited man had stayed up entirely all night in the kitchen. At noon, right downstairs at the downtown office building. The glass revolving doors reflected a blinding, cool-toned white light, and Angus stood right in the center of that glow. He wore an exquisitely tailored dark blue suit that perfectly outlined his broad-shouldered physique, his tie knotted immaculately. His flawlessly sculpted face bore a daunting coolness. Yet, in his sharply defined hand, adorned with an expensive mechanical watch, he held an outrageously eye-catching pink bunny thermal lunch bag. As the thermal bag was unzipped, steam billowed out. Pork ribs, seasonal veggies, and tomato egg drop soup. When Carlos popped the last rib into his mouth and completely cleared the containers, the man's tight jawline instantly softened. The corners of his thin lips curled up into a fleeting, uncontrollable upward curve, only to be immediately suppressed back into a flat line. "What do you want to eat tomorrow?" Angus looked straight at him. "Isn't your company busy?" "It is." Angus' gaze was so deep it could pull a person in. "But when you're pursuing someone, you have to show the right attitude. No matter how busy I am, bringing you lunch comes first." In this undeniable manner, Angus filled every single crack in Carlos' life. Carlos grew accustomed to the clinking of metal in the kitchen at dawn, the pink thermal bag downstairs at noon, and the tall silhouette on the sofa at night, flipping through documents and occasionally glancing deeply in his direction. Until one night, when the harsh sensor light in the hallway flickered on, and Billy poked his head out suspiciously. I hear Angus shamelessly forced his way in. Billy leaned against the doorframe with an incredibly punchable smirk. "Carlos, if you really wanted to kick him out, calling the cops or changing the locks would've done the trick. But you didn't." He paused deliberately, his eyes sweeping sharply over Carlos' face. "Are you secretly into him too?" "No, I'm not." "Then why are you blushing?" Carlos subconsciously pressed the back of his hand to his cheek. The blazing heat radiating against his skin left him no room to argue. Under the pale hallway lights, his usually cold and distant features seemed entirely soaked in the warm hues of a sunset, a thin veil of inescapable redness surfacing at the corners of his eyes. "All right, stop being so stubborn." Billy dropped the smirk, his expression becoming more serious than ever before. "There is something I've been meaning to tell you. Every time Angus took those things from you, he was never doing it to piss you off." The cold hallway light seemed to stretch and freeze in that very moment. "Every time he swiped something, he'd be overjoyed, wanting to give it to you, only to get yelled at and met with your icy glares." Billy's voice echoed through the empty hall. "All those things you rejected?" He carefully locked every single piece away in a massive, custom-built display case in his study. Every single one, preserved flawlessly. As those words landed, it felt like an invisible thread violently tightened around Carlos' heart, hitching his breath for a split second. He said that one day, you'd finally accept them. Billy looked at him, sighing softly. Carlos, Hez waited a really long time. The motion sensor light clicked off, leaving only the warm yellow glow seeping through the crack in the door. Carlos stood silently in the entryway, his eyes fixed on the door that had just been pushed open. Angus, holding 2 heavy bags of fresh groceries, blocked the doorway with his towering frame. He seemed just about to speak. "Angus." Carlos cut through the silence before the man could say a word. "Yeah? You said earlier that you like me? When did that start?" Angus set the plastic bags down on the counter, his broad back going instantly rigid. The restless golden dust in the air seemed to hang frozen mid-flight. "From the very first day I met you, you really are a freak." "Yeah." The man turned around. His usually unfathomable eyes were cast down, looking like a massive, lonely dog left guarding an empty house. A gloomy, aggrieved orange aura seemed to ripple around him. "Liked you for so long, and I still haven't won you over." A long time. So long that the hopes forcefully buried in his heart had almost bled his soul dry. Carlos took a deep breath, forcefully blinking away the stinging dampness welling up in his eyes. "Angus, come here." The towering man obediently stepped up to him. Carlos tipped his head back slightly and, without a shred of warning, planted the lightest of kisses on those tense, thin lips. As for the rest, let's see how you perform. The stagnant air shattered into a million pieces. Angus stood frozen, a raw, uncalculated ecstasy lighting up his eyes, a look Carlos had never seen before. Okay, Il put on one hell of a performance. But Carlos had clearly underestimated Angus' terrifying ability to take an inch and run a mile. In the days that followed, Angus didn't just drop off lunch, he began acting as a personal chauffeur, driving him to and from work every day. By the office's floor-to-ceiling windows, a few subordinates couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Carlos, are you and Mr. Angus dating? You guys look perfect together." Carlos replied with a completely straight face, "Hess, not my boyfriend. Hez my arch-rival." "Mr. Carlos, does an arch-rival open your car door with an umbrella every day? And look at you like you're the only person left in the entire world?" Carlos kept a frosty expression but didn't argue. Because right there in the glass reflection, the man waiting by the car door was radiating a thick, blatant joy that even a blind person could feel. Until that late night when a torrential downpour hit. The cold blue sheet of rain crashed against the downtown asphalt, like solid walls of ice. The entire world was painted in a dismal, icy grayish blue. As Carlos stepped out of the lobby, his pupils violently contracted. Angus stood at the base of the storm-battered steps like a marble statue. His dark blue tailored suit was entirely soaked through, clinging tightly to his broad shoulders and well-defined chest. Rainwater cascaded wildly down his sharp jawline. The second he spotted Carlos, the man took massive strides forward, holding his sole black umbrella firmly over Carlos' head. "Why aren't you using an umbrella?" Carlos' voice trembled through the rain. The wind was too strong. It blew one inside out. "I was worried if I waited in the car, you wouldn't see me when you came out." The man's deep voice mixed with the rain, lacing a blunt, pity-seeking calculation into his words. Staring at that pale, rain-drenched face with its piercingly bright eyes, Carlos violently yanked the man under the lobby's awning. He whipped out some tissues and pressed them hard against Angus' dripping forehead. "Duck your head down. You're too tall, I can't reach." Angus obediently stooped down, allowing Carlos to scrub him down roughly. Those profound eyes were locked dead onto Carlos' face, the corners of his mouth curving up in a smile he couldn't hide. "What's so funny? You're smiling ear to ear." Frustrated and anxious, Carlos smacked the tissues into the man's chest. "Wipe it yourself. Are you an idiot?" "I have no intention of dating an idiot." The wiping motion stopped cold. "What did you say?" Angus grabbed Carlos' wrist, his scalding body heat searing straight through the soaked sleeve. "You said dating. Did you just admit it?" "I did not." Carlos' ears instantly flushed beet red. "You said it. I heard it." Angus pressed closer, water droplets tracing down his sharp brow and splashing against the back of Carlos' hand, leaving a burning trail. "Say we're dating." "No." "Then why are you wiping my face?" "Because you look like a drowned rat." "Then why didn't you let someone else bring an umbrella? Why didn't you push me away?" Angus' low chuckle rumbled intensely in his chest, carrying a resolute sense of control. "If seeing me out in the rain makes your heart ache this much, how could you ever bear to let me go? Carlos, is it really that hard to admit you like me?" Angus' burning breath brushed past the bright red tip of Carlos' ear, layering unquestionable dominance with tenderness. "It's fine if you don't say it. As long as I know you like me, that's enough." "I don't." Carlos' face felt like it was on fire. He abruptly shoved away the scorching wall of muscle in front of him and scrambled toward the car parked in the rain like a fugitive. "Get in the car." "Right away, Mr. Carlos." Standing in the pouring rain behind him, the man laughed recklessly and triumphantly, his radiant aura lighting up the entire stormy night. The night settled in deeply. Towering Angus was curled up comfortably in the corner of the sofa, looking like some newly domesticated wild beast. He was squeezing into a visibly undersized white tee and gray sweatpants, both belonging to Carlos. "When are you going to buy some clothes?" "You can't keep wearing mine forever." Carlos' eyes were glued to the TV, not daring to glance sideways. "Tomorrow, and you're coming with me." The man spoke with absolute entitlement, not even lifting his eyelids, as if this were a truth engraved in his DNA. Carlos pretended not to hear, but out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Angus swiping on his phone. The screen's faint white glare cast a light on his sharp, defined jaw, and right on the display was the official homepage of a high-end luxury jewelry brand. "What are you looking at?" "Rings," Angus answered without looking up. "For a proposal." Smack. Carlos practically lunged over and snatched the phone away, glaring at him in utter disbelief. "What proposal? How long have we even been together?" "A very long time." Angus naturally raised his head, staring straight into Carlos' eyes. "If you count from the very first time I saw you, or from that time you kissed me, I've been getting ready for this for years. That's long enough." Looking at that face brimming with stubbornness, deep affection, and an edge of obsession, Carlos suddenly felt all his strength drain away, his throat tightening up. "Angus, are you absolutely sure about this?" He lowered his gaze, his fingertips digging fiercely into the seams of the leather couch. "You know my personality. I'm incredibly stubborn. I have a terrible temper. I can't cook. I can't keep a room clean. And I'll probably even yell at you. I know. I'll cook, I'll clean, and I absolutely love it when you yell at me." Angus cut off his retreat without a moment's hesitation. The man leaned in, his broad shadow fully engulfing Carlos. Those warm, golden specks of light, much like a summer twilight, moved with his steadfast voice, aggressively sweeping away all of Carlos' self-doubt and wrapping him flawlessly in a sphere of absolute safety. "Carlos, I know everything you just said." Angus locked eyes with him, the reflection of that slightly pale face swimming in his deep pupils. "Because it's you. I love you exactly as you are." His heart gave a violent twitch, and an intense wave of stinging emotion shot straight to his nose. Carlos jerked his head away, a glaring redness instantly flushing the corners of his eyes. A second later, a searingly hot, breathtakingly broad chest pressed flush against him from behind, the man's chin digging possessively into his neck. "Don't cry." The raspy voice swept past his ear. "I'm not crying." "Okay, you're not crying. My mistake." The man behind him obediently corrected himself, though his arms banded around Carlos like iron hoops, locking him firmly in place. "Carlos, I won't force you into any decision. If you want to take it slow, well, take it slow. I've waited all these years. A little more time won't hurt." Carlos buried his burning cheek deep into the back of the couch, his thick lashes fluttering wildly. After what felt like an eternity, he tipped his head the slightest fraction, speaking in a muffled, nearly inaudible voice. "I think I might like you a little bit too." The arms cinched around his waist stiffened violently. Angus froze perfectly still. A few seconds later, a low, heart-stoppingly gentle laugh began to vibrate wildly from deep within his chest. "You think?" The man's lips brushed against Carlos' earlobe, exhaling a breath as hot as fire. "Not just think." Carlos' voice grew even fainter, the skin along his neck blushing a deep crimson. "I guess I do. Like you." The man didn't press for anything more. He merely tightened his grip abruptly, as if wanting to crush the person in his arms and fuse their bones together. Through the thin layer of fabric, Carlos could clearly feel the heart behind him thrashing against its ribcage at an unimaginable, frantic pace. Thump, thump, thump. The deafening heartbeat drowned out the noise from the TV entirely, prompting the radiant golden light around them to pulse and flicker wildly in time with the chaotic rhythm. "Angus, your heart is beating so fast. Are you nervous?" "Yeah." "Terrified you might take it back." The man buried his straight nose firmly into Carlos' neck, taking a deep, desperate drag of the scent that drove him crazy, like a man gasping for oxygen. "You said you liked me. You absolutely cannot take it back." "Say it again." "Never said I was taking it back. And I'm not saying it again." "Say it again." "No, Carlos." With a low sigh that blended shamelessness with pure ecstasy, the man's scorching kiss crashed down like a wild, uncontrollable tempest, completely sealing off whatever words were left unsaid. The ultimate golden brilliance blazed ferociously around their intertwined silhouettes, burning forever eternal in this absolute realm of warmth.
And that brings our story to an end. Carlos and Angus are just incredibly sweet together. My absolute favorite part has to be the basement scene. Carlos thought he had everything under control, using his clumsy revenge plot to trap Angus, completely unaware that he was the actual prey walking right into the snare. Angus was madly in love with him, yet he spent every day chasing after Carlos, just to exchange a few words. Even though Carlos never gave him the time of day, giving up never even crossed Angus' mind. I think that's exactly why Carlos fell for him. After all, when you're surrounded by such an intense and consuming love, no one could stay immune. And Angus was incredibly smart about it too. He seized every single opportunity to get close, using his shameless persistence to slowly take over both Carlos' physical space and his heart. From staying up all night to perfect breakfast, to showing up with lunch every noon, and even stubbornly holding up an umbrella to give Carlos a rain-free sanctuary in that downpour, even if it meant his own custom suit was entirely soaked. When a proud, untouchable man like him willingly drops all his defenses to clumsily win over the one he loves, how could anyone have the heart to turn him down? Even someone as stubborn and proud as Carlos couldn't help but yield to an Angus like that, finally confessing, "I think I might like you a little bit too. Would you want to partner like Angus?" Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.